I'll
This
leave it to Jeff
conference will
and
now be
Michael.
recorded.
Take it away.
Hey, everybody, it's the Kubernetes Korner show. And today we got a fantastic guest. We always have fantastic guests, but today we have a super fantastic guest. And for one reason, it's not the same person you thought it was, okay? It's no longer the old Michael Cade. It's now Michael Cade, Global Field CTO, okay? So Michael Cade's going up in the world. But what a lot of people ask me is, well, what's a field CTO? I think it's because every time he talks to me, he's in an airplane. But maybe Michael can tell us.
Yeah, hey Jeff, hey everyone. Yeah, so nothing's really changed. So for the last 2 years, I've been focused around like Kasten, Kubernetes, open source, and getting my head around a lot of that world. And I think this is just so I had to do that for 2 years or 2 and a bit years, and then it was so the role kind of just cements what I'm doing in that space, as well as I'm also going to be doing, as I've been doing anyway, is talking a lot more about the cloud uh, in relation to like AWS, into Azure, GCP, and kind of there's three elements to it. And I'm sure many of us either listening in or on the call right now, you're either doing something with the cloud, and that might be just storing your backups there or storing something there. You might be already in the cloud. You might be then like using EC2, and you might be then looking at how can I expand on my cloud usage and how can I be a little bit more efficient and how can I take advantage of some of it. Or you're then going down that cloud native route. And so really it's about all three areas that I'm now focusing on, even though I was kind of doing it before. So still the same me, Jeff. No change.
Well, one thing that I think it means, and correct me if I'm wrong, is it means that Veeam is taking very seriously the cloud native world. So there's a lot of focus and attention on that. And this is like, as they say, putting their money where their mouth is kind of thing.
So I think you're absolutely right, Jeff. I don't know why they put me in at the top of the tree for it, but we'll go with it until I get found out. But yeah, absolutely. For those, so with Veeam, we had our launchpad event, which is basically our sales kickoff a couple of weeks ago. And Danny, the new boss, CTO of the company, he stated that Kubernetes is a strong part of our strategy, and obviously it has been for a number of years, but now we're actually seeing the rubber hit the road and starting to bring in some of that revenue that pays for the acquisition of Kasten, but also the premonition of what we saw as this is a future, this is 2 years out, this is 3 years out, is actually coming to fruition as well. So yeah, exciting time.
Good to hear what you said too, because you hinted at the imposter syndrome, and that's one thing in the Kubernetes world. I mean, I remember in the Windows world, I never heard it at all. Everyone was a superstar, but in the Kubernetes world, you constantly hear that. Oh, I don't feel, and I get it too. I go into a conference like, do I really know what I'm talking about? So we could do a whole show on that as well.
Well, I think that's a great place to start, Jeff, as well. In that, like, if we think about vSphere, we think about Kubernetes, we think about storage, we think about our data services, databases, etc. And if we can both remember back where the directive, I think the directive was from Microsoft at the time around Microsoft SQL not being fit or not being applicable or supported on a virtualization environment. And I think that's kind of where maybe we were 18 months ago from a Kubernetes point of view as well, in that we were very, so you had storage available to your virtualization cluster, your vSphere environment, but you probably didn't want to put fast moving transactional workloads on top of that. Either the vendor itself from a Microsoft point of view, or it was a licensing thing from maybe the likes of Oracle. And I feel like we're treading the same path again, Jeff. I think the storage world of Kubernetes, and we'll get into some of it. I keep looking over there because I've got all my notes from all the recent Kubernetes releases. But I think the majority of us on the call are going to have definitely come from that infrastructure admin, that virtualization admin type space. And I know what that feels like when you're pushed in front of Kubernetes. You don't necessarily think you need to learn this new platform, but you have to. And there's a lot of correlation between what we had to go through from a VMware point of view to where we're going and what we're seeing from a Kubernetes. However, I will say that it's massively accelerated. I remember back in the day, like if we go back to ESXi 3.5, we would then get like version 4 and version 5, and it would be that yearly cadence, similar to what we see from a Veeam major product release cycle. Kubernetes gets to release 3 times a year, and that's consistent over the last 7 years. So that speed to market, that speed to get into the point where we're no longer having to log into like the shell of your ESXi host or ESX host at that point has gone away. We've UI'd everything. We have APIs for everything, and basically we've simplified that journey of virtualization. And I think we're fast approaching that from a Kubernetes point of view as well. Jeff, I don't know if you want to touch on some of those areas. In fact, what's your view?
I'm glad you brought that up about databases, because I think the last call we had, we talked about, the whole movement in Kubernetes and how slow or fast it's moving. Now, if you noticed, what you brought up right away was databases. So this conversation is shifting. We're now going to actually specific applications. And I'm glad you brought that up, because somebody said to me not too long ago, well, yeah, I can see, a use for Kubernetes, but of course, databases, no. And it sounded very similar, because I'm old enough to remember, when the physical to virtual machine thing happened. And there were same kind of arguments. Oh, yeah, well, this is a great, interesting new technology, but this application will never make it there. And then it does. And so I think I was talking to you this week about it, like Oracle now, they are now containerizing these, they are testing these, and they're bringing it out. And of course, there's the question of, statefulness, which, way back when, well, no, containers, you restart them and that's it, everything's gone. Well, that's totally gone now. I mean, now there is stateful, but now we're at the point where even fast moving databases will work in containers. And so what you'll probably see, I'm predicting, is something similar, that when people see the advantages, all the savings, time savings, and the convenience of containers, it'll be very similar to what we saw from the physical to virtualization movement. So that's really interesting. As far as, I see, again, and this, it's kind of funny, because I think we talked about a circle. All this circles into other things. So again, bringing up this database situation, people want to learn. It's more motivation. Like the person sitting on the fence saying, well, should I waste my time? And then what? Now Oracle's got a container for this? Where do I learn? So it's funny. It's all tied in. So yeah, I mean, have you seen and heard a lot about this, the database argument now shifting, away from the fear or, it won't work?
Yeah, 100%. Like, so speaking to customers, prospects, etc., and the community in general around, I don't know if I should store my database, which generally a database is there. It's going to be storing some pretty important stuff, right? But yeah, it's definitely shifted, and there's some key features that have been introduced into Kubernetes over the last year that really just tick just enable that box ticking exercise to give you that peace of mind to say, actually, yeah, that we are ready to run that mission critical workload in there. And then when companies, to your point, Jeff, when companies like Microsoft, like Oracle, and loads of others containerize their application or their workload, that kind of also gives you that peace of mind that this has been through a vigorous support and testing, so that it's going to work in that environment. I think that's the other important thing as well, is that Kubernetes probably 18 months to 2 years ago was very focused on the developer, and maybe it still is, but as a developer, you wouldn't really care about the platform that you're using. You're just going to jump into something. I would argue that actually, like I have done about Kubernetes, is a platform. Like virtualization is a platform for virtual machines, Kubernetes is a platform to run our container images and our services within that. I've said it all along since I jumped into this world, is that virtualization isn't going away, but it's going to sit there alongside, a bit like cloud, right? So anyone out there is probably running an element of virtualization, an element of cloud-based services, and then you're just going to have some Kubernetes and some SaaS-based workloads alongside that, because you're going to pick the right horse for the right race. Yeah, so I think some of those features and functionality around, I think it probably started from the CSI point of view, so the container storage interface, and that gave the storage vendors, the NetApps, the HPEs, the Dell EMCs, the ability to bring their storage out of band for the Kubernetes major release and just plug directly in with some features and functionality within there. Things like the ability to volume snapshot, expand those snapshots, which is something that we saw in early 2022. Being able to expand that if you've created a LUN that is going to be for holding your database, maybe you under provision that and maybe it needed to go from 500 to a terabyte. You couldn't necessarily do that very easily in Kubernetes prior to I think it was the Stargazer release, the 1.24. You couldn't expand that on the fly. You'd have to do a migration from A to B to be back up and running. You don't have to do that now. We can expand that, like, again, very similar to vSphere, right? Being able to extend data stores within VMware.
Yeah, and actually to add on to the SQL thing, when we talk about it's a new topic, I was actually talking with a friend of mine who works at Google who survived the layoffs. And I said, well, and he's been working there for a while, but I said, what was the thing that really you were excited about? He goes, well, he's a big SQL person. He goes, the SQL queries were so fast on Borg. And so first of all, I realized that they're still using Borg. Kubernetes. They've been doing it. Someone told me once that this is all coming out to the world, but the big companies were doing this. They just didn't really tell us. Anyway, so moving along, I want to ask you about one of the things I think people are interested in, the future. And since you've got this big position now, you're the crystal ball, and you'll help us figure out what's going to happen, where to place our bets, right, on the money. So first of all, maybe about the releases. I know personally it's difficult for me. I have to force myself to always look. It comes out quickly, like every 3 releases a year. Sometimes there's things you don't really, and sometimes there's boom, this is big. So where the upcoming releases are coming, I know we discussed there's some really interesting things, especially for backup people, CBT. What can you tell us about that and what you find especially exciting?
Yeah. So change bot tracking, for anyone not familiar with that abbreviation, is going to enable, especially from our point of view. So this is going to be baked into the Kubernetes next release. So it's not just from Kasten's point of view. Anyone can take advantage of it. Now, we have been heavily involved in the writing of that, as well as some other engineers from Dell, a guy called Ivan, who actually used to work for Kasten. He's moved over. But that open source world is something maybe we get into, Jeff, as well, because I find it absolutely incredible, the open source environment. But yeah, so change bot tracking is going to enable us, in particular from a backup perspective, is that we're going to be able to be very efficient on how fast we can take a backup from day 1 to day 2 to day 3. So if you think about it, on day 1, we're going to come in, we're going to take a backup. Let's say it's a 500 gig backup. We're going to have to back up everything. We're going to have to back up that whole 500 gig. Yes, we could do some compression, but ultimately we still have to walk the whole file system. We have to understand that. We're not magicians. That has to happen. On day 2, let's say it's a rate change of 25 gig. Then in the world at the moment, we either have to rely on data movers to understand what has changed. So it might mean that we have to walk the file system, which takes time, to understand what blocks of data have changed, before we then say, okay, these ones have changed. I only want to take those. So where change bot tracking comes in is that we don't have to walk the file system. It's already native to that storage, which means that we know the blocks that have changed. So we're only going to grab those quickly. So we're saving the time in terms of having to walk the file system. Now, if we go even further back, and this whole premise and concept is the same as what we see for physical machines and virtual machines and cloud-based machines as well, is that before we had any sort of change bot tracking, and we're talking pre-Veeam at this point as well, is that we would have to walk the file system. We would have to take that 500 gig. Come to day 2, we would have to take another 500 gig because we didn't know what changed. So we'd have to just keep on taking 500 gigs worth of data. Now we might land that on some sort of dedupe device, which condenses it down at that point. But how long does it take to walk through a 500 gig? And I'm obviously just using that as an example. Now think about that being a 5 petabyte type environment, type application. It becomes a, how am I even going to fit that into the day? And that's what we did see. So along comes change tracking to change the way in which we are more efficient when it comes to protecting the workload. So again, very quickly, are we implementing a feature that has changed the world of virtualization backup? It's not just Veeam. We've done some work there as well within virtualization around change block tracking. We have our own change block tracking engine that we use, but bringing that skill and making it available out there inside the community for other competitors, storage vendors to take advantage of, is just the right thing to do in terms of this is how we continue that raising awareness that adoption of Kubernetes and stateful workloads within Kubernetes is a go. Like we can do that.
What apart from that, is there anything else that really stands out in the upcoming releases? I mean, I know the kubectl debug, which is basically a system where you can debug a container, has arrived. It was in OpenShift before, to be fair. So that's something I think is either arrived already or is coming. But is there anything else that kind of sticks out? And then we should talk about the open source world, because that's a lot of fun.
Yeah, so there's a few things around like being able to monitor persistent volume. So a persistent volume is, think about that as a LUN being presented from a storage system into your Kubernetes cluster. For those that aren't familiar with that, there's not really any visibility of that. So like we have Veeam for our virtualization environment. It will provide the traffic light system to say things are good, things are not so good, and things are really bad. A PV health monitor, persistent volume health monitor, is going to give you that ability to have visibility of volumes and be able to warn someone or something if something bad happens with that persistent volume. There's also some work. So in the last release, there was that expansion. There's some issues with certain storage vendors, so they're obviously being retrospectively fixed as well. Another area, and I don't know if this goes into what you just mentioned, Jeff, as well, is around this read write once pod.
Mm-hmm.
So at the moment, you have read write access pods that you would install your like MongoDB or your database service, and it would have potentially, if you scaled that out accordingly, it would have multiple connections into your PVC, your persistent volume claim. What this read write once pod enables you to do is just have one single pod that can just dive into the storage and then disappear. So it looks similar to read write once, but it is actually a specific pod that's given the access to. What else is in there? Alongside the changelog tracking, the differential snapshot. So understanding what's changed since the last one as well. So being able to really have quick snapshots, understanding what's changed since the last one for block volumes in particular. Another one is, so if you were to dive into the constructs of a database, it's probably not just going to be one persistent volume claim. In fact, Jeff, I'm sure you've broken into like Custom, which is a microservice within Kubernetes. It has multiple PVCs. It might have a PVC for metrics. It might have a PVC for a catalog. It might have a PVC for a database that does something else. So it has many different databases or data services that make up this one application. From a backup perspective, pre this version, we have to go in and we have to think about those as individual PVCs. We have to go and collect each one. We have to do it potentially in a not in a parallel format. We have to do them in a singular, like one-stop shop for each one. What they're implementing in this next release of Kubernetes is something called volume grouping. So you'd be able to say, okay, this is all associated to this one application. I want you to make sure that they can all be collected and uh, captured in a parallel type manner. So being able to group the snapshot together, if you will, is another big thing. There's a load of other things, and somehow I put a document together of everything. Maybe that's a good post for.
Yeah, it probably is a blog post. I said I look at the release notes, but sometimes it's overwhelming. So one of the things I want to talk about, again, you brought up open source world and the other world, whichever that is. And for me, not being part of one of the big corporations like the big sellers, I always like to look at it comparing KubeCon to, let's say, I don't know, VM Explorer or something like that. And a very simple systems engineer's point of view, okay, is at KubeCon, people are kind of, it's very developerish and conversation is very deep, very technical. Clothing standards, kind of whatever you want. Whereas VM World or whatever, tie, suits, smile. Hi, my name is, So I don't know. That's a very primitive view from a young system engineer, but that's kind of what I noticed. When I went to my first KubeCon, I mean, there was swag's everywhere, of course. So but there was that kind of thing stuck out that it was KubeCon was, and it's changing, as I think you said. The KubeCon was very developer-ish, and the open source world tends to take that point of view. So on a serious note, I think it's a challenge for organizations like Veeam and Kasten to be friends with the open source world, not alienate them, but also you have to make a living, you have to sell, right? So this is an interesting point, a talk point, which I think the technical people especially will be interested in.
Yeah, so I would so my first KubeCon was the virtual one during the pandemic, so 2021. So you didn't really get a good grasp on who the audience was and who was there, right? Then fast forward round to KubeCon NA, that was in Los Angeles. I wasn't able to travel to the US, but you could see it from afar, and that was where we started to see the infrastructure admins start to arrive here and start to come and speak to us because they have the responsibility around data. So they came and spoke to us on the booth. Then fast forward round to Valencia, which Jeff, I think you go to Valencia?
I was remote because Veeamon was the exact same
No.
time. So I was in Las Vegas. I was
Yeah. So
spiritually in
oh yeah.
Valencia.
Yeah. So exactly that. So I missed out on Valencia because I was at Veeamon in Vegas as well, talking all the good things about Kubernetes, but whilst they were having a party in
Yeah.
Valencia. But again, feedback from the team was that we probably don't need so many of the actual developers, the engineers that are building K10 on the stand anymore. We now need to bring in our systems engineers and have that quality conversation around what it is we do and be able to demonstrate it from a front end point of view with business requirements involved. And then get round to Detroit, which was KubeCon in October, November time, back end of 2022. And I finally got to go to a KubeCon in person, which was the same time as Veeam 100 in Prague. So unfortunately, I missed that, but I was able to go to my first KubeCon. That'll be fixed this year, so I'm told. So I'll be at Veeam 100 as well. But and so I got to see it for myself in that there was definitely still the developer centric folks there as well, but there was definitely infrastructure admins that wanted to learn more about what Kubernetes was, and it's obviously cloud native con as well, so it's not just Kubernetes. We hear a lot more about things like WebAssembly and serverless and other areas as well. But going back to the original part, so that progression goes hand in hand with what I was saying earlier, right? About Kubernetes isn't only a developer platform, if it even can be considered a developer platform, unless they're going rogue. Ideally, if my developers are developing on something that I'm not managing, then are we really doing our infrastructure, our platform, are we looking after our business at that point? But going back to the open source world, is if we think we've got, and to get there, we've got to go all the way back to Kubernetes, and obviously open source was around long before Kubernetes as well, but it kind of helps me paint a picture of open source and the importance of open source in our world or in our industry today. So 7 years ago, Google released their version of Borg at the time into the open source world, into the cloud native computing foundation, Linux Foundation at the time, and that enabled companies like Red Hat, like VMware, like XYZ, name big vendor. They can then start contributing to that and make it Kubernetes what it is today. And if you look at the maintainers and contributors of Kubernetes, you'll see there's hundreds of people that are going from just fixing little documentation issues to full blown features and functionality, like I mentioned, around things like change bot tracking. Our team are heavily involved in that. So the benefit there is that we're building a platform to the standards that we want. Then you've got the companies that are leveraging that, the OpenShift, the Red Hats, that are leveraging that distribution as part of their OpenShift offering. And the reason why they're coming in there is they're obviously offering support, functionality, and enterprise features above the baseline Kubernetes.
Yeah.
And then you can go, and Jeff, feel free to jump in with other examples. Like there's VMware have their own distribution of Kubernetes, Rancher, SUSE also, and there's quite a lot that you probably even haven't heard of out there as well. But I think it's important, like, so we contribute to that Kubernetes project as well from a Kasten point of view. But where it starts to get quite interesting is when you start moving workloads into production. That's a whole new ball game when it comes to, okay, there's no support line that you can just ring up. My Kubernetes cluster's down, or a couple of the nodes aren't working. Okay, you can open up a GitHub issue, you can explain what your problem is, but there's no SLA on that. No one's like, you might be lucky, but there's no SLA. There's no one. You're not. There's no Kubernetes support team by all accounts.
I
So it's
say
on the
that too, that one of the things that you hit the nail on the head, because people ask me, well, how do they make money? It's open source. Well, that's the point. You just spelt it out very simply. Is that yes, open source, and yes, you can use it. But remember, we've been talking about Kubernetes being a learning curve. Okay, we've been talking about a lot of rabbit holes. So you might be a specialist in CSI, you might be a specialist in CNI, which is networking. Okay, but are you a specialist in everything? Like, I'd answer no. So when your production's up, do you want to be the wizard who fixes everything? That's where the services come in. That's where people can make money. And what I like about this, and the parallels I see with the learning, is that you get organizations that provide free learning, okay? And then people who engage in these communities. So they're giving a bit of themselves, they're working, but they're getting as well. And so it's a very similar thing. These companies, they're not evil, big, no, they give something to the community, like Kasten helping out with Canister or these open source projects, and they get something back. And at the end of the day, the companies that have big production and need to have that phone number at 2 a.m, because Jeff might be exhausted, and it's like, who do I call? Ghostbusters. But that's where I think the key lies. And so it's not only a intellectually fun world, because it is, because you're getting a lot of free resources to be able to build and develop systems, but also it's a serious world. It's not just a hobby in the garage on the weekends. No, if you have production, there are companies out there, that's why they exist, who will provide that for you. So anyways, I wanted to, since we've got you here and we've already, sent you the big CTO and got your ego all up, we're going to try to find out some information, obviously, because how often this happens. So we talked about predictions. How about predictions about VBR, integration, Veeamon, things like that? I mean, what can you tell us without getting fired?
Yeah, so we don't have to predict anything. I can tell you what's coming. So first of all, let's just recap on what we've got on the truck already from a Kasten K10 and VBR perspective. So the first aspect is, if you're running anything with vSphere, anything on vSphere, leveraging the vSphere CSI, then you've got the ability to send your K10 backups into a Veeam repository. So that's there today. We've got a few customers doing that. It provides the ability, if you've made an investment in a dedupe device or some on-premises data center, and suddenly you've inherited this Kubernetes cluster and the requirements around that, it might make sense just to let's have everything in one place, just all under one Veeam repository. Might make sense. The second iteration, as we get closer and closer to V12 VBR, is the ability to centrally manage your Cast and K10 clusters. So Cast and K10 is deployed in each and every Kubernetes cluster that you have. So if you've got 10 across different platforms, so it could be EKS, GKE, AKS. I'll have to leave some people out, but so if you're running different workloads across different locations, or you've got different teams running different Kubernetes clusters, then you can have them all added to Veeam Backup Replication and have that visibility of what the jobs are doing, what from a recovery point of view, and all of that good stuff within there. So central management, very much like what you see, if anyone has seen what we've done with our Veeam Backup for Cloud products, so Veeam Backup for AWS, Azure, and Google, just having that central location to be able to manage everything under one roof, but by still having the ability to have that modular. If you are only a Kubernetes house, you don't have any virtualization or physical, or maybe you're using something different for those platforms, that's fine. Or it's different teams, that's fine. You've still got the ability, obviously, to go and deploy Cast and K10 in that point. Now, the exciting bit that I don't feel like anyone's really spoken about, and this is kind of I know that this is my plan for Veeamon to talk about this, even though it'll be GA, but I think it's important. So if we think about Veeam and how it came around for the virtualization platform, it started off being an agentless approach to backing up virtual machines within VMware, where the competition at the time were installing their physical agents on the boxes. So that was the first big ticket item that Veeam came to market with, a differentiator in the market. The second thing, not that far off, was instant recovery, instant VM recovery. So that's the ability to take that virtual machine backup, present it as a data store into your vSphere environment, and have that machine running from potentially, well, hopefully, not as good storage, not as expensive and fast storage, but your application is now up and running, and then leverage storage vMotion under the hood to bring that application back into the fast tier of storage. So we were back up and running in seconds. So take that and fast forward that into the Kubernetes world, and again, has to be vSphere CSI backed, so VMware technologies again. But think about like instant FCD, so first class disk recovery. So think about those PVCs, they live on a first class disk. So what we'll be able to do from the K10 interface is be able to hit a button, and that will instantly recover that into your vSphere environment. And that could be to recover, actually, the application's dead in Kubernetes and we need to get back, or it could just be a clone, and then the whole migration back into that as well. So I don't think we've spoken about that a lot. Like last Veeamon, I got to show the centralized management, the platform services aspect of how we're going to centrally manage this K10 within VBR alongside virtualization, physical NAS, cloud. And now we fast forward, because this is another area that is worth shouting about, because of the speed in which, or the sprint that we work on from a custom engineering point of view, which is every 2 weeks. There's a release every 2 weeks. There might not be the big ticket item release then. There'll be bug fixes, there'll be enhancements, there'll be security patches, but every now and again you get those few little golden nuggets that land in that feature.
Notes, yeah. So that,
the release
that's
notes.
really good news. I mean, that really opens up possibilities, like things like sure backup for Kubernetes potentially, because you instant restore. I mean, I'm going, you don't have to pay me for that idea, by the way. I mean, although, no, but I mean, that really is, I have not heard of that before. Instant recovery in the Kubernetes world. That definitely is something new. And and we talked about databases before, that's one people want. I mean, as it always people say, backups are not important, recoveries are, restores are, right? You can have a billion backups with green, they're all good, and then you go to restore and they're not. So you want to be certain, and that would be one of the ways you could do it, even if you're just doing it manually, but I'm certain you could script it through the APIs. Wow. So that's really fantastic news. Okay, how about Veeamon? Because I know I've been hearing things that Veeamon, they're pushing more and more Kubernetes here and there. I mean, Danny Allen, every time he comes out, I've seen he says something about Kubernetes, and I'm wondering, have you been paying him beers or something? I mean, who knows?
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. So yeah, Veemon will be in May this year. I'm sure you've got the dates better than me, Jeff, but I think it's May the 20th for that week.
I have to Google it. No, I'm joking.
So we're toying with an idea, and it hasn't been approved yet. So this might actually get me fired. But the idea around, obviously, there's a lot of administrators, infrastructure admins, uh, the traditional role that would come into a Veemon, like myself, but they're intrigued by what's next, like what is Kubernetes, but maybe there's no good way of being able to get to grips, get hands on with that area. Plus, if your company are investing in you to come to Veeam, you probably want to look at the now. You probably want to spend those 2-3 days in breakout sessions learning about like enterprise applications, around NAS, around Veeam Backup Replication version 12. How can that help me today in my world? With the idea that we've got is that on day 0, we're putting forward, I'll keep on caveating that this hasn't been approved, is
Well, it
to
will be
spend
now,
2
right?
yeah, surely this will help. Is that spend 2 or 3 hours in a workshop type environment where we literally run through in an isolated lab away from any credit card charges, completely included in the Veeam price, if you will. The ability to run through, create a Kubernetes cluster, deploy an application within cluster that we all know, like from a virtual world environment. I'm thinking about like WordPress, for example. If we go back to our VMware Explore session, me and Anthony, we covered around like WordPress. WordPress can live on a physical machine, it can live in a virtual, it can live in a cloud, it can live in the cloud native, it can live in Kubernetes. So thinking about how we take that application and then installing K10 or deploying K10 and then using K10 to protect that application and recover that application into our environment. But whilst also going through some of the theory around that, and in particular the theory around that is relevant from a vSphere administrator. Now, I get that we don't just have vSphere administrators coming, so I'll keep it as broad as I possibly can in terms of the correlation between that. But I will be, again, this hasn't been confirmed either. One of the breakout sessions that I submitted was Kubernetes for the vSphere admin, which just so happens to be the same title as Cormac Hogan's book that Jeff put me onto yesterday.
Yeah.
But hopefully, I'm good friends with Cormac, so hopefully
Just
he
don't
doesn't.
tell him,
Yeah, hopefully he doesn't track me down and get me for that title. But the premise of that session is to really focus on, so within Kubernetes we have the concept of nodes, and we have the concept of worker nodes, and we have the concept of control planes. And so I want to get into how does that compare. So if we think about Kubernetes as a orchestration engine for containers, if we think about vSphere and VMware is an orchestration engine for virtual machines. So our virtual center is very similar to a control plane, and our worker nodes are ESXi nodes. I'll go into more detail around that. I shouldn't hijack this to tell you it, but so yeah, that's the plan, and then expect obviously everything in between. Lots of sessions around cloud, and lots of sessions around VBR v12, NAS. I've seen at least one session about tape. So for anyone that's mad into their tape, Dave Russell, big shout out to Dave Russell.
Well, I think especially the Kubernetes thing is interesting because one thing that people ask me a lot is they want to have questions because they get to a certain point, they might be at point 0, they might be at point 10 in their development and their Kubernetes learning, and they want to ask a question. And while there are a lot of online forums and whatnot, some people just are more comfortable in person. So if there was, someone recently asked me, if there was an event where you come up and say, hey, Jeff, I know you, or I know Michael Cade, or I know somebody else, I feel comfortable with these people. Can I ask you a question? Can I ask you a dumb question, Jeff? Because you're pretty dumb yourself. Yeah, okay, that's fine. But so, it's that kind of thing. And I personally remember that too, because I was kind of, insecure, especially when I was studying the CNI, the networking, because networking to me is like, you know, um, and so asking somebody, which I don't think any questions are dumb, by the way, that's just, but you feel that way, especially you go into a new technology and you don't want to say something that's really ridiculous, right? We've all done it. So I think something like that out of Veeamon would be fantastic, because I've got a lot of Veeam, people I work with and people I see and the customers I see, and they have these questions. So they kind of hijack my time. Say, hey, Jeff, you don't mind? Yeah, sure. But I don't know everything. So that's really interesting. Hey, on that note, what's happening with the Cube campus, which is the former Kubernetes learning site, which was turned into Cube campus? Is there anything new on the horizon there?
Yeah, so this is the platform that we'd be using for the learning day as well. So this gives us the isolated environment to be able to run through the building a Kubernetes cluster, deploying an app, and deploying K10 without us having to put credit card details in. So the continuation around labs in there for those that have been great. There's probably, I think there's 12 labs now where you can run through various different features functionality of Kubernetes. It's not just Kasten K10 focus. I know I know my favorite one from last year. Not that you asked that, Jeff, but I'm going to tell it anyway. Is around the monitoring reporting, because that's a big area for Kubernetes, is having visibility into that workload. And Kasten K10 integrates into Grafana. It leverages Prometheus, two open source projects that enable us to have some data visualization of our application. Kasten K10 drinks its own champagne, not eats its own dog food. Around it is a microservice architecture. So, and what that means is that we send all of our metrics into Prometheus, and Prometheus then sends it to Grafana, and then we visualize what that looks like. So what the lab does is walks you through what the premise of monitoring and reporting does, and with that, we can do so much more with Grafana itself. So Grafana gives us the ability to interact or integrate into tools such as Slack. So if something bad happens, tell me. I want you to notify me in Slack, because I seem to live my whole life at the moment in Slack channels. So tell me there rather than sending me an email, but it can also go with SMTP as well. So it's just about extending that. Now we are using K10 as the app, but the premise behind that is the importance of observability within Kubernetes is probably even more so than what we've seen within VMware. However, the VMware tools started somewhere. Veeam started somewhere in that visibility of the infrastructure or of the platform.
Yeah. And of course, Grafana is, I've seen also from Jorge at Veeam, Grafana, you can connect that up to vSphere and Office 365. I remember I played around with that. So yeah, that's definitely. One thing we didn't touch upon, but I'm interested, I think we did a bit, was I signed up recently to the GitHub Canister repo to get all the emails. So people don't know GitHub, you can watch it and then you get a billion emails. Every time someone sneezes, you get an email. It's a lot of fun, but it actually was interesting because for a non-developer, you see how the software is built. So tell me more about Canister, because that is a really useful tool, which Kasten leverages, but you could also just do Canister on your own. So explain that to people maybe.
Sure. So yeah, Canister is an open source project, lives outside of K10, but heavily used by K10. But Canister is an application data management framework. Now, let's simplify that. So when you've got a database such as MongoDB or Postgres, or let's use Postgres. So with Postgres, we could go and just take, and it's a bit like a Windows VM running Microsoft SQL. You could absolutely just go and take a backup and cross your fingers and your toes, and hopefully when you come to recover that, it's going to come back. The database will be there and you'll have everything. What Canister provides, a bit like VSS in the Windows world, is that consistent, that we're going to truncate the logs, we're going to speak to the native database system, and we're going to say, okay, this is what I want to do. We're going to pause the IO, redirect that, and then we're going to take a copy of that and store that into object storage. And the way in which we do that is via blueprints. So you can bring your own blueprint. We have some already in the GitHub repository, canister.io. You can get there for that, and lots more resources in explaining in detail what it is. But that Postgres database that I mentioned, so we would create a blueprint to say, from a backup action point of view, I want you to go into the Postgres database. I want you to leverage PG dump, which is the native way of being able to take a consistent copy of that database. I want you to QS the logs. I want you to truncate the logs. I want you to then spit it out and put it into AWS S3, or to put it into a location profile that we'll get to in a second. Then you're going to have a backup, a restore action as well. So what happens when I want to bring that back into? So again, an if this then that type workflow. And then you're going to have a delete action as well. Like what happens when I no longer want this backup anymore? How do I get rid of that in a safe and proper way? So I mentioned one thing, location profile. We want the ability to be able to store that backup, that PG dump, that tar file. Want to put that somewhere. Now, Canister out of the box, we have the ability to send that to an NFS location or to an object storage location. So Google Cloud Storage, AWS S3, S3 compatible, etc. So yeah, all of those are options as to where you'd want to like throw that consistent copy of that database. But at that point, it's just the database. We're not with Canister. Canister's not going to worry about the whole application. So in comes Kasten K10 on its white shining horse, and now couple all of that together. We're now going to look at the whole application. We're going to bring back all of the pods, the deployments, the stateful sets, the services, etc., as well as that consistent copy of the data via Canister, and bring the whole application back in the state it was, but in that consistent state as well. So that's a very, very short way of explaining what Canister is. So we have blueprints for Postgres, MongoDB, Elasticsearch, the Microsoft SQL, MariaDB. There's a long list.
And you could probably write, if you have your own special application, there's nothing from stopping you, as long as you know what your application needs, basically to be ready for backup, you can write your own blueprint if you have the ability. I had a bit of a scare here, by the way. You might have seen me jumping around as if I had termites in my room. I suddenly got a notice saying your battery's low on your Mac. So what? I had unplugged it. So, you get these things. But I thought it was really calm. No one noticed, huh?
Just on the Canister thing, if I can, like, just on the. So we've spoken a lot about data within Kubernetes today and how that is progressing and how it's a thing. The other thing that is very much worth a mention is that, well, what happens if you've got a web front end or a stateless front end that lives in Kubernetes, but you're leveraging something like AWS RDS or Google Cloud SQL as your backend database because reasons. That's maybe you traditionally moved there and now you've adopted this, and you still are on the fence about pushing your data inside of Kubernetes. Obviously, that's fine. When it comes to data protection, though, AWS will keep that service up and running, but they don't care about that data. Maybe I shouldn't use the term "don't care." They're not going to. They're not going to.
Shared responsibility.
There you go. It's the shared responsibility model where your responsibility for your data. They'll keep the infrastructure up. They'll keep the platform available. Now, when it comes to data protection, there you still want to be able to protect it as part of that application. So with Canister, we have the ability to leverage blueprints to go outside, pull on those APIs within RDS, and take a backup of that as well.
Yeah, that's
which also opens up another door of and something that I've been speaking a lot about is around database migration. How do I get my database from a virtual machine into Kubernetes or into RDS? And I feel like that's a big area that we're going to see a lot of in 2023. Not necessarily from us, like we have tools that enable us to do some of this. There's some research going on around how we can help better the migration path and of both the machines and databases. But I think that's a big area that is going to be very interesting for this next 12 months for sure.
Yeah, and the migration too and whatnot. I mean, the vendor lock-in. It's funny, all these terms, they just don't die, you know. We think, oh, there'll be a brand new technology, we'll get away from all these things. No, ransomware, vendor lock-in, they just follow along, and so you have to have a solution for them. But okay, so one other thing I want to ask was, have you heard anything in the world of the Cloud Native Foundation? What's happening? Any, you know, interesting information about overall general?
Um, so I've been heads down on V12 and getting that out the door. So I haven't really been hooked into CNCF, and I know that they're probably focused on KubeCon EU, which is going to be in Amsterdam, April the 18th, I think, for that week. So it'll be interesting to see that out there. But no, I haven't. Well, unless I've just forgotten. But yeah, I can't remember anything in particular around what they're up
It's kind
to.
of overwhelming because there's so much happening. That's one person said to me the other day, Jeff, you know, this Kubernetes is really interesting, but there's so much happening. I mean, look, Veeam releases V12 at the same time, Veeam for Salesforce, all this stuff, and how do I keep up? And so, well, you watch the shows, we'll tell you, you know, you're all set.
Yeah.
But yeah, so one other question I had was about edge technology, because somebody asked me the other day, well, what is this Kubernetes edge stuff? And it says in the custom documentation, we, you know, back up K3S edge. And so what I said to make it interesting, I said, well, you've got a beer fridge, yeah? I go, yeah. Well, one day your beer fridge will be run by Kubernetes, so you better learn it. Oh, he went right to the books, you know. But the idea is it can be the Internet of Things. Kubernetes can be everywhere. It can be in an airplane. The U.S. Air Force tested it. In sensors and devices and a fridge. So that's what it is, and it needs to be backed up. I mean, do you want your beer fridge, you know, software to be backed up? Yes or no on Friday night? Yes. You want an instant restore, right? There you go.
So I think in regards to I think edge is another kind of a buzzword out there in the world as well. The way I see it is that edge is just another area that we need to deploy some sort of infrastructure, whether that's a Raspberry Pi or a cluster of Pis, or whether it's small form factor compute, or even just full blown small racks of like actual 2U servers type thing. From a Kubernetes point of view, the if you think about Kubernetes not only as a platform, but think about it as the operating system of the cloud, and it can run on any of the multi CPU architectures, it opens up the doors to now we've got the same look and feel across our Raspberry Pis, to our data center, to our cloud. And what that also means is that mobility story also plays a huge part in there. I can run my same application on a Raspberry Pi, big asterisk and star there, as I can in the data center as well. So maybe one thing that we did want from a virtualization point of view, and I know VMware have a strong game when it comes to edge as well, but it's VMware. It's very proprietary software. It's not free to manipulate and have that fast innovation. Still great technology, but Kubernetes opens up the door much more wider than VMware and virtualization was ever able to go on that front. And then when you see like KubeVirt, which is basically the reverse to what we see with VMware and Tanzu. We see OpenShift and KubeVirt, or KubeVirt standalone. This is the ability to manage virtual machines as a Kubernetes object or a resource within Kubernetes. I feel like that is another trend that we're working towards. I don't feel like it's going to become mainstream for that world within 2023, but 2024, 2025, I feel like Kubernetes is the control plane for a lot more things to come. Is my weather forecast.
We'll all have to learn YAML inside out. That's the YAML files.
We'll have
Okay,
YAML
well,
engineers
29
before
minutes.
long.
Yeah, that's 29 minutes. I don't know if anybody had questions or anything, and I kind of lost my panel when my, oh, there it is, when my laptop said it was going to turn itself off. So, yeah, I think that's probably it then, because we're right on 30 minutes. Thank you very much. And again, I want to remind everyone, it's Michael who actually started the Kubernetes Corner. So he's like the person who owns the Kubernetes Corner. I'm just like a guest, you know, brought in to make the jokes. But thanks a lot, and we'll see everyone next time. Next time, we're going to have another show, I think, in February. Oh, it's February already. Maybe March. I'll have to look it up, but it'll be announced. All right.
There
Thank you
is
very much,
one
everyone.
question.
Oh,
Oh, sorry, Jeff. There's one question in
sorry.
the chat.
Let
I
me
don't know if you're
reply in
able to
chat.
Let me
see
have a
it.
look.
This is go to meeting, so I'm like a newbie. Maybe someone can read the question before it take me an hour to figure out where's the chat?
Can I migrate Postgres application taken by Canister and blueprints to another cluster? Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure on I see you mentioned OpenShift 3.11. 3.11 is an old version of OpenShift. Best, look at docs.caston.io, ask the question in Kubernetes Korner. But yeah, the whole idea of that canister is, yes, we can move. So one of my demos at Veeamon was the ability to migrate from RDS into a stateful set. So bringing it out of that PaaS into Kubernetes. We can also look at going the opposite way as well. The OpenShift 3.11, I'm not sure of. I believe you're right in that it's an old version. I believe that we can get you out of there into a newer version, but I don't know the caveats. Docs.caston.io will give you that, and ask the question in the corner. Cool.
Okay.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.